Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar. So we are MedGenome, the leaders in genetic testing in India. And the topic for today's webinar is next-gen sequencing for next-gen clinicians, difficult codes demystified. And our speaker is Dr. Sheetal Sharda, Senior Consultant Clinical Geneticist at MedGenome. Dr. Sheetal is a pediatrician and has done her DM in medical genetics from SGPGI Lucknow. She has worked as an associate professor in genetics in PGIMR Chandigarh for 8 years. She has over 14 years of experience in clinical genetics. She also has about 30 publications in national and international journals to her credit. Her areas of interest are in dysmorphology, prenatal diagnosis, and molecular diagnostics. So before I hand over to Dr. Sheetal, I just want to inform the audience that if you have any questions or comments, you can use the Q&A window of the Zoom conferencing browser, not the chat window. So any questions, we will address them at the end of the webinar. And if there is, we will also send out a recording of this webinar in a week or so. So you can go back and revisit any points that you missed out or you want to understand further. So without any further delay, I will hand over the screen share to Dr. Sheetal, who will take it forward.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to yet another webinar from MedGenome. Over the past few weeks, we have been possibly attending more webinars than we have attended our clinic. But slowly, as we gear up for the new changes, over past few weeks, the webinars have made me realize that there are many questions in the mind of clinicians related to next generation sequencing. So I take this opportunity just to share whatever little bit of experience I have in next generation sequencing with clinicians. And I have tried to keep it very basics, understanding that just as I was a newcomer, I didn't know anything about it. It took me a lot of time to understand the jargon of words and the nitty-gritties of what NGS is all about. So taking this opportunity and moving forward, I can just start with that genetic testing is important to establish the diagnosis, irrespective of the system of involvement. So right from neurology to nephrology to cardiology, each and every system is important nowadays to get a genetic diagnosis where suspected. So we can use any type of sample. You can use the human DNA, you can use the RNA, the chromosomes, the proteins, or even the metabolites to confirm your diagnosis. So why this is important is that I would like to go back a little bit to the MBBS level where we were taught the central dogma of life. So DNA is basically our code, the genetic code, which is ultimately going to decipher what we look like. So what is who we are. So DNA is transcribed to the RNA, so that is called transcription. And then the RNA is translated to a protein. And the protein is what is causing the various functions of a body. So that is going to finally decide whether a patient will have cardiomyopathy, muscular dystrophy, or retinopathy, or all of them, right? So what we as clinicians basically look is the final outcome of our DNA code, which is the phenome. But we can make use of the metabolites or the proteome to come to some clinical diagnosis. But the transcriptome and the whole genome is basically what we need to work up for to come to a very good genotype-phenotype correlation. So there are various genome analysis techniques nowadays which are available, and many of them are even absolute, but we can only classify them based on your clinical interpretation. Whether you are looking at some known diagnosis with a known mutation, or you are looking at something which is unknown and you want to wander out into the unknown territory. So based on that, there are various tests available, and every test has a different indication. Every test has a different utility and limitation, and we should be aware of them before sending it out. So the genome analysis techniques start from the low definition, or what we call as the karyotype, which can be seen under the microscope. So for chromosomal disorders, or which are known chromosomal or microdeletion, microduplication syndromes, you can make use of the chromosomal arrays or the karyotype. But when you want to look at deeper, something which cannot be assessed at the microscopic level, you have to go submicroscopic or at the level of the DNA, this is when you need to use the other molecular techniques such as MLPA or sequencing. So since we are talking about sequencing, it is basically when we want to analyze the person's DNA. So the sequence of the person's DNA is determined to see if there is any variation present, and that variation whether it can explain the disease. So ultimately we are trying to confirm a genotype-phenotype correlation, but in a clinician point of view, we have to have a phenotype-genotype correlation because you have to confirm the phenotype with a particular type of a DNA variation. So this is a DNA sequence. It is what is, we can call it normal. So just like a binary code in a computer language of 0, 1, which has just 2, we have 4 letters which are going to decide our fate. And we all know, again, going back to biochemistry, that a codon or a compilation of 3 of these codes or nucleotides will make 1 amino acid. So the 20 amino acids and the stop codon or the start codons are ultimately coded by this sequence. And you can understand that a lot of things can go wrong within these repeats or these ATGCs which are there in the code. So the Human Genome Project, which was completed in 2001 and came out as a final draft in 2003, it finally confirmed that we have around 3 billion base pairs, which are responsible for around 21,000 protein coding genes. So you can see that there is a lot of chance where these 3 billion base pairs can change their places. Even among 2 people, if we say not 99.9, but even if we say 99.6% individual differences, it could mean almost 4 million differences among 2 individuals. So if you just want to know the extent of what this 3 billion is, it is almost the number of seconds you have to count for around 95 years. So that is a lot of data which has to be analyzed. So what can go wrong? Anything which can change the normal DNA code in reference to a reference sequence is known as a variation. Initially, we used to classify it as polymorphism if it is present in more than 1% of the population, and mutation if it is present in less than 1% of the population. But now it is more of being called as a variation. We don't call it a mutation or a polymorphism, but possibly a variation, and it grossly falls into 2 classes. So if you see a typical, if you can see a typical gene figure here, you have your exons, you have the introns, you have the promoter region, you have the transcription initiation codon, you have the translation start codon and the stop codon. So if this is a small cartoon of one gene, we can have various types of mutations or variations in them. So it can be at a single nucleotide variation at a single point. It can be short insertion deletions, which would be like as less as 2, 3, 4, or more than around 20 base pair deletion duplications, which can be this variant. And there could be larger deletion duplication, also known as CNVs or copy number variation. So for testing all these, we can do a NGS. So what are these single nucleotide variations? Again, they can be different. They can be missense, they can be nonsense, where there is a truncation of protein. There can be a silent variation where the amino acid does not change, or there can be splice site variation. So these are the various types of variations which can happen in your genome. So we have to do sequencing. So sequencing is basically deciphering the DNA code. We can either use the Sanger sequencing or we can do the next generation sequencing. Sanger sequencing is a traditional method developed by Sanger in 1977, still used, still is a gold standard, but the limitations are that we need to have a prior knowledge of the genome or the target area which we need to test. It has a limited size of sequence. We cannot go on and on for sequencing by Sanger. It might take time, it's costly affair, and it is labor intensive if you want to sequence a large data. It is not useful for patients with unknown genetic etiology. So if you have a child with achondroplasia, clinically and radiographically, if you have confirmed it is nothing but achondroplasia, then test like Sanger is easy. You know the gene, you know the variation. Even in one single gene, FGFR3, there is one mutation, 11838A2G, which can cause achondroplasia in 99% of the patients. So it is very easy. In such cases, you can send just for Sanger and not going for any more higher definition test. There are certain diseases in which there are multiple genes involved. So in this also, Sanger becomes a little cumbersome because you will send for one gene, it will come negative, then you send for the second gene, and then you'll wait again. So it becomes difficult where multiple genes are involved or where there are very large genes. Now DMD is a 79 exon gene. There are genes like HBB, which are 3 exons, but there are more than 300 mutations which have been, or more, which have been known till date, published in literature for HBB. So for such cases, Sanger is not useful, and hence the conventional targeted Sanger sequencing is now practically powerless in the face of the ever increasing number of varied new genes and new variations. So here comes the role of next generation sequencing, which is a high throughput, massively parallel, and is a very rapid sequencing technology. Just to compare, something which took almost 13 years with 2,000 machines running, equal amount of people managing the machine, and almost like 1.2 million for 1 GB raw data initially. Now we can have just one machine, just one person churning out around 2,500 million bases per day per instrument. And the whole genome, which had taken 11 years, can be completed in just a few hours. So this is a big paradigm shift from converting from Sanger sequencing to next generation. So basically here also, it has enabled large scale assessment of multiple candidate genes. Moreover, prior knowledge of the genome is not required. You can start sequencing for the unknown and get some result. So evolution of technology, we all are aware, whether it is a telephone, whether it is the camera, or whether it is the computer. We know that we have to evolve. So technology has evolved. Similarly, NGS sequencing platforms have evolved too. So there are multiple sequencing platforms available right from 1984 till recently. They are changing. I will not go in detail in any of these. It's more of a technical discussion. But just basic, yes, they differ in designs. Besides that, the run times may vary. Some machine might do your genome in hours, some may take days. Production ranges also differ. Read lengths differ from 100 base pair sequence to more than 1500 base pair. The platforms would differ. Accuracy per base also increases. So almost like 0.1%, which is a very good accuracy, to errors as high as 15% in the long read base pair platforms. We have a large chunk of errors coming up. Cost per base, as the high throughput increases, as the number of samples increases, obviously the cost per base will go on decreasing, and that will again come back to how much cost it would be to the patient. So the basic difference, or what I would say the most important difference, is the sequencing principles. So every platform uses different methods. They might use pyrosequencing, they might use sequencing by ligation, sequencing by generation or synthesis, or reversible diet terminators. But ultimately the work of all these machines is to churn out sequencing data. Even for different scales, we have different machines, right from something which churns out just 1.2 GB to machines which churn out almost 3000 GB of data per machine per day. So as the companies or as the research needs larger sequencing regions, they need high coverage, they have multiple samples, they have to go for higher end machines. But for smaller samples, smaller people doing little work, they can go in for a smaller version of the same thing. The platforms change, costing definitely increases, but per GB price decreases. And we can see that innovations in this chemistry, optics, fluidics, even computational hardware, and the experience or skills of people who are coming up with using NGS, the cost has come down in a big way. And probably the dream of sequencing the human genome at $1,000 is not a dream, but a reality. So now coming on to the NGS workflow, which is more important now because it would include the interpretation of the reports. So NGS workflow, right from sample collection, preparation, DNA extraction, library preparation, sequencing, coming to bioinformatics, and then going on to give a clinical important report takes many steps. This is what takes time, right? So the overview, if we see, there is the wet lab where the library preparation and sequencing goes on. Then there is a bioinformatic team which does the sequence analysis, the variant detection and the annotation. And then there is the clinical reporting team which does the variant analysis, right? So overview, now I'll go to just the primary and the secondary analysis part. So if you see the primary analysis, which is done by the bioinformatic team, you can see that the exome sequencing data, which comes out from the machine, is to be converted to a readable form. So the first data which comes out is known as the FASTQ file. And then there are various alignments done according to the reference sequence, because we have cut up the DNA and we are trying to align them together, and we are also aligning them to a reference sequence. So all this is done by various softwares and various algorithms. And finally, when the primary sequence, the refined sequence are coming to a readable file form, it is known as the variant calling file or the VCF file. And it is at this level that finally the variant annotation is done. And in a routine exome sequencing read data, the final outcome from all this primary analysis would yield almost 20 to 30,000 variants. Now this is a lot of variants, and it is not easy to filter them out to make it clinically relevant. So there is another step after that, in which there is what is known as the heuristic filtering ranking. So that out of these 20,000 variants which have been filtered, we have to again use various filters to come to a causal or a candidate genetic variant. So the various filters which are used is either, firstly, we filter out the common variants using certain databases. Then we use the information which has been received, whether we have to look for an autosomal dominant variant, so we have to look for heterozygous variant. For autosomal recessive variants, we have to look for compound het or homozygous variants. Then we have what is called as variant binning. Here, the variants which are found are then segregated according to the type of variant, whether they are nonsense, frameshift, indels, splice site, or missense. And then these variants are then classified on the pathogenicity based on certain prediction softwares. And after that, based on whether those variants are reported in certain public database, and finally with a phenotypic correlation, from these 20 to 30,000, we might come down to a few dozen of variants. Still a long way to go. So just an example, if we have certain variants which have been shortlisted after all this filtering, and we see whether they are well covered in the reads, and we have seen that what is the classification of these variants, and then whether they are rare or very common in the population, we check them in the IGV, and then we classify them according to the American College of Medical Genetic Classification. And these variants from 3,000 coming down to 30 also takes a lot of steps, and yet we still don't have something confirmatory, right? So now these are certain jargons. You will ask, what is this coverage you are talking about? What is this IGV? What is this minor allele frequency? So I'll be taking all these one at a time. Basically, it's a jigsaw puzzle which we have to complete at the end of the day. We need to have as many clues as possible. The most important clue being the clinical indication. I will come to that later on. So we have something called coverage, we have something called depth, we have minor allele frequency, we have in silico prediction, and then we have the IGV. So all these are various clues which will help us complete the picture. So what is coverage? What is depth? Ultimately, these two things are going to tell us that we have enough data for analysis. So a coverage is the percentage of the genome which has been sequenced with a depth more than 0, right? So a coverage is of the gene. A gene XYZ has been covered well. So the gene should be appropriately covered. We have to take a perfect number, 98-100%, but there are certain genes which are very complex. They have more GC content. They have more regions which are complex. They don't have adequate probes there. So they might be covered less. For example, if we check NCF1, which is a gene which causes chronic granulomatous disease, CGD, and it is sort of one of the most important, but the coverage in NGS is just maybe in some samples it would be as low as 56%, in some it would be 70%. So if the gene is not well covered by the probes in the kit, then we might be missing on good variants. So we always have to know what is the average coverage of the gene. If it is a very low covered area and it is equal in all samples, then it is basically because of the complexity of the region. But if the coverage of the gene is low in one sample but adequate in other samples, then probably it might be a deletion or it is not covered well. So are we missing something? Is it a sequencing error? Do we need to redo this? So all this becomes for coverage. The depth of the variant. Now depth is the average time or average number of times a base is covered. So now we have 3 billion base pairs. We have shredded the genome and we are aligning it. So there, and we have these shreds of 150 base pairs. So not necessarily every shred would be 150. Some would be 140, some would be 130, some would be a little longer depending on the sequence. So, but they are being overlapped. So ideally every shred has 150 base pairs and each base pair has to be read at an average number of times. So we can take that average as 30. But ideally what we take is the average depth of the variant should be between 70 to 100. So if we keep this as the target, it could be read more number of times. It could be 300 times, it could be 400 times. It could be also lower. But an ideal to give us confidence, it should be at least like 30 times. So if the depth of the variant is good and the coverage of the gene is good, means you have a well covered gene of interest and hence you are confident when you give the result. The only thing is that you can either have the increased depth or you can have the increased coverage for the same amount of data. Ultimately, it comes down to good data. So if you have a good depth, but you want a good coverage and an ideal depth, then the pricing will go up. So in the same amount of money and wanting the same amount of data, something has to be compromised, right? So if you want more depth, you may have to chill out more money. Now coming to minor allele frequency or what we know as MAF. So there are many common variants in public databases, or means we all are having those variants. We are just 1% different. So 99% of the time we might be sharing many variants, and there are databases which were conducted to just what we call as normal population. Now normal means at a particular time they are not having symptoms of a particular disease. So when we collect data of such so-called normal human population, we have a variations. So those common variations which have been reported in public databases will give us what is the minor allele frequency in the population. So we have various databases. We also have our own Genome Asia database now. So as told, according to Mendelian hypothesis, rarer the variant, higher the chances of it being pathogenic. So as the allele frequency goes higher, the chances of the variant being significant goes a little lower. So we take the cutoff of 0.5, but it would be different for autosomal recessive conditions and autosomal dominant conditions also. Now coming to disease databases. You have found a variant. It is not a common variant. You have filtered it out. by all the methods, and you have a certain set of variants. Now you want to know whether it is reported or not. So the reported variants means they are disease databases. So OMIM, HGMD, ClinVar, GWAS, SWISVar, there are many other disease databases. Individual disease like Rett syndrome database you might have other single gene disorders which there might be researchers who must be having almost like 1,000, 2,000 sample database, which may not be public, but they may have it in their own lab. We can always contact them. But as you can see, all these databases, there are not many who have common variants. So some variants may be reported in ClinVar, but they may not be reported in Cosmic. They may be reported in 1,000 genomes, but they are not reported in SWISVar. So as you can see, we have to go to multiple databases to see whether the variant is reported in any of these, because it will help us, give us some confidence that, okay, it has been reported previously in a patient, in a heterozygous manner, in a homozygous manner, in a compound heterozygous manner, whether functional studies have been done. So we have to have this literature search for each and every variant which is detected. Sometimes we find novel variants for which we don't have much information or literature. So we have and if we find a novel variant, we cannot do function study for each and every variant which we are finding. Everywhere, if you see literature, daily there is one paper coming up, novel mutation found, new gene found, but there are very few research labs who can ultimately go up to that functional level and confirm the pathogenicity based on in silico, in vivo tools or animal studies or creating zebrafish or mouse model. And it is really not possible in day-to-day clinical diagnostics to have functional studies. So we depend on what is known as in silico prediction tools. Basically, they are just algorithms based on certain hypotheses they have or certain proofs they have, where they predict whether the variant which you have found can be significant, whether it is going to damage the protein, whether it will truncate the protein and cause a small protein or a non-functional protein, or whether it is well conserved in literature or not. So all these algorithms or a combination of many can ultimately give a score which can help us classify the variant, whether it is pathogenic, likely pathogenic, or a totally benign or a likely benign variant. But we have to keep in mind that they are just predictions. Based on predictions, whether to totally ignore a variant or to give it high confidentiality is still which we have to cover. And now coming on to IGV. So we all are aware of a chromatogram which is received in a Sanger report. So in a Sanger, you are reading just one sequence, forward and reverse, and you have whether the variant is present in one allele or both alleles, so whether it is heterozygous or homozygous. Now here we are visualizing hundreds of reads. So to come to a conclusion whether variant is heterozygous or homozygous, we need to visualize it in a software, right? So we have this interface which is known as integrated genome view, which gives us details of the variant. So as you can see, here we have that we are using the genome reference, which is 38, which is the latest. It has come out in March 2019. Before that, it was from 2009 to 2019, it was HG37. So converting from 37 to 38 leads to another lot of changes in the transcripts which we find. So if there is a report which was done by HG37 and now you want to do it by HG38, the description of the variant might change a little bit. So here we are seeing from this IGV that this is chromosome 10, the gene is PRF1, this is the reference sequence, as you can see, orange, blue, red, green, so 4 nucleotides. So the reference sequence has G at this position, but when we read this, there are few reads which are showing A. So when we see the IGV, the red line is showing the positive strand, the blue line is showing the negative strand. So here we can see that the positive strand, positive, negative, both sides there is A, but in 50%. You can see the read length Read depth is 227. So the same base has been read 227 times, of which in 49% of the strands we found A, and in 50% we found G. So this is a 50-50% alignment of the alt allele. You can see from here also that this is a good confidence level of a heterozygous variant in the PRF1 gene. Similarly, here if you see, this is a FANCL gene, it has to have C, but in almost 61 reads which we have checked, in all the forward and reverse reads, we have T. So it is 100% of the reads are showing T, and it is a homozygous variant. Sometimes we might have a variant which is very close to each other. Here you can see that there is one variant which has changed from T to G, and another variant nearby which has changed from C to T. So now we have reads which are 150 base pair. So any variant which is nearby within the 100 base pair region, we can be a little confident, okay, we are dealing with compound hits. But if they are beyond this region, we have to do a Sanger confirmation to confirm whether they are on the same allele or different alleles. We all discuss about ACMG. Those who have started sending reports, interpreting reports, we should all read this. This has been the recommendation of ACMG to give reproducibility to variants which have like multiple labs doing same work but giving out different classification, different analysis reports or interpretation. So we should all be having certain guidelines or SOPs. Some companies use the original stringent, some have come with combination, they add their own values to it and they improvise on it. Being stringent is that we might be having a little less diagnostic yield because we focus more on literature evidence to give conformity to the variant found. So when do we call it as pathogenic? So pathogenic is when you have sent the sample for a clinical phenotype which you are very confident about. So the suspected disorder which you have sent for and the result has come back. So a variant which can explain the clinical phenotype very well, and we have enough literature for the variant as we filter out, then it can be reported as pathogenic. Sometimes you get a very good variant which can contribute to the development of disease, but due to some scientific evidence, like it has been reported but functional studies have not been done, the variant is reported nearby, not in the same codon, but a nearby region, you have found the same variant, but again, no functional studies, right? Or you have found a variant which has been tested in animal studies, but not in human studies. So there is lacking of scientific evidence to confirm that this would be a pathogenic variant. So for partial, we will give it as likely pathogenic. And there are benign and likely benign, which are filtered out based on various algorithms itself. They are not even reported according to the guidelines. And between these two extremes of pathogenic and benign, there is a big chunk of variants which are known as variant of uncertain or unknown significance. So here it is that variant is good, it is matching, but we still do not have a confident scientific evidence to classify it as either pathogenic, neither we can ignore it. So, you know, it is a gray zone, but there can be certain more things which can be done, more steps which can be done to convert that variant of uncertain significance or reclassify that variant to either pathogenic, likely pathogenic, or we can ignore it to be benign or likely benign. And these various steps, I will be discussing it when I come next to the case studies. So this is the original guideline, ACMG. Then there have been certain refinements happening because many people felt that we are being subjective or we are not reporting adequately and we might be missing out on good variants if we be so strict. So they give more refinement criteria so that we become a little more confident in classifying it as, instead of LP, can you give it as pathogenic, Or if it is VUS, can we at least consider it as to be a LP? So all these refinements are happening and various guidelines are coming out. Many labs take it up, make their own classification accordingly. So we can conclude that it is not very easy. We are getting a large amount of data, and from so many millions of variants, we have to come down to one or two relevant variants which can explain why your patient has what he has, right? So we have to organize, analyze, interpret the data in a biological, meaningful manner. Finding a variant and putting it in the report might be easy, but whether it is justified. So variant analysis is not a needle in a haystack, but is a needle in a deep haystack. It takes a lot of interpretation, bioinformatic tools to finally come to a final conclusion. So final report, if you see, whenever you read a report, along with the final conclusion, always try to read the interpretation. So the variant description would tell that the gene is 100% covered. It would tell that it is a missense variation, which exon it is, which chromosome it is, the G is converted to T, and the depth, right? It will also tell you the change in the amino acids. So aspartic acid has been changed for alanine, at which codon. So it is, when you start reading the reports, many of them, you will understand that it's not very difficult. You can see the depth, you can see the coverage, then it is lying in a critical protein domain. So these domains also, we have links for that. We have databases where it can show that the variant, if it is lying in a very critical protein domain, even a missense variant can change the structure of the protein. And then you can see that it is not reported in the public databases. So 1000 Genome, EXAC, or the internal database of the company. So we don't have it, means the MAF or minor allele frequency is 0. Then again, that the in silico predictions are damaging by 1, 2, 3, 4. So every company is confident about using few tools for over a long period. They may have access to all the tools. Some are free, some are paid. They may have access. They may have their own interpretation. They may have their own scores. But the best, and for what they are more confident, they always use it to put it in their report. But you can always check the reference section to see what they have been using. And then the reference codon is conserved. So based on all this information, finally you can see that they have classified this variant as likely pathogenic. But again, it has to be carefully correlated with clinical symptoms. So as all other medical legal reports go out, whether it is an MRI, whether it is a blood count, whether anything, the final is that it has to be correlated with the clinical symptom. We all are carriers of more than 9 to 10 pathogenic variants. If you see the literature, you can have 2.5 like mutations which can be causing very severe disorders, but you don't have it, right? So until unless you have the clinical symptoms, whether that pathogenic report, likely pathogenic report, is significant or not is ultimately dependent on the classification. So now this is again a report recently we received for understanding the variant. So this person was suspected to have cholestasis, and he was found to have a mutation in PFIC2 and classified as pathogenic. No other information regarding this variant was found in whatever was shared with us. But when we looked at literature, this is a missense variant, reported variant, but you can see the minor allele frequency, 58%, 56%, 60%, means 60% of the people are moving around with this variant, and there are almost 13,000 homozygous cases. Now, homozygous cases, if they have this variant which is pathogenic, they must have symptoms, right? But they don't. So, and moreover, when we saw the other databases, it was benign by all in silico prediction, even by ClinVar database, SwissVar database, HGMD, everyone had reported it as benign. So ideally, this should not have been classified as pathogenic. I have taken this slide directly from ClinGen's website, and this is what is important, is this gene associated with the disease? So what is the clinical validity of the gene? The variant, you have found the gene, okay, it is matching the phenotype, but is the variant causative? What is the pathogenicity of the variant? And whether this information is actionable. Can you take any decision based on this? For research basis, it is good. You find, but you have reasons or you have proofs, you can do something more to prove it. But for clinicians, for diagnostic report, this answer is very important before we finally come to a conclusion. Excuse me. So why is NGS a better method? Okay, for common mutations, we do use genotyping method. As I told earlier, achondroplasia, the common mutations in HBB gene, almost 85% of the Indian population, if screened for 15-20 common mutation, they might find it. So common mutation, it is good. But for uncommon mutations and for novel mutations or new genes, you may have to go for NGS. The thing is, when to do genotyping, when to go for NGS, it ultimately depends on your clinical diagnosis. So why do you want to use a sword when you can do something with a needle? It's the same principle. So how to decide whether to send a gene panel, a clinical exome, whole genome? So as I explained previously, in the DNA, we have the exons, we have the introns. But we should also be aware that 85% of all disease-causing mutations are positioned within the coding exon. So it is just the exons. So if we just analyze the exons, probably we'll be picking up almost 85% of the disease-causing mutations, but in conditions which are well described in literature, or what we call as, which follow the Mendelian inheritance pattern. So an exome is just 1% of the whole genome. So if you can calculate whole genome, you are doing 1%. So obviously the cost also would be 1% of it. It ultimately comes down to pricing. So you can do anything. You can just do target panels, limited genes related to a disorder. If you're very confident of your diagnosis, you can go in for the whole exome. You can definitely go for the whole genome, which will be doing non-preferential sequencing of the whole of your genome, right? But in between, you have an option of doing a clinical exome. If you see Western literature, if you see all journals, you may find nothing which is called as a clinical exome. So clinical exome basically was developed for India. I can say that confidently, because we always balance the amount of information which we can get with the amount the patient can spend, because it is always from their pockets, right? In Western countries where insurance is there, clinical genetics, they are being insured, they can go for whole genome, they can go for whole exome, but if you see literature, they will not say whole exome, they will say trio whole exome. So when it comes to our population, where we want to balance between the amount the patient is spending to the amount of confirmation of the diagnosis, we can have an in-between panel, which is known as clinical exome. So the amount of information is obviously single gene will be related to single gene, and whole genome will be to the whole of the 20,000 genes, including the introns and exome. So just to highlight, or just to give a purview, when you have a minimal locus heterogeneity, you are sure it is cystic fibrosis, you have one gene, send for single gene test. Achondroplasia, I already told, one gene, one variant. You can only go for that single gene variant. It can also be done by NGS, it can also be done by Sanger, right? But then there are certain limitations to NGS where you may have to send for other tests. Your NGS will not be appropriate for trinucleotide repeats or epigenetic malformation, microdeletion, microduplication. So you have to decide some other test. Then you have the gene panel, where you have a broad range of genes. So there is a genetic heterogeneity. The phenotype may be typical, it may be muscular dystrophy, but you have many genes which cause muscular dystrophy. It could be DMD, it could be LGMD, it could be other whole plethora of sarcoglycopathies or dystroglycopathies, but how will you know without doing a test? So here, if you are sure it is muscular dystrophy based on clinical phenotype and the CPK and the other tests you have done, then send for panel. Similarly, cardiomyopathy panel, again cardiomyopathy has overlapping phenotype. Epilepsy panel is one in which they have only seizures, but they have a completely different overall presentation. Some may present very early, some may present with seizures and then go in for a neurodegeneration. So all those epilepsy genes can be tested together. Then there are genes which common pathways. So you have rasopathies, you have celiopathies, in which the pathway is the same. There will be overlapping phenotypes like Noonan syndrome or Leopard syndrome or cardiofacciocutaneous. They form a part of the same pathway. So you can just send for the rasopathy gene panel. And then there is the exome sequencing or genome sequencing. So for extreme heterogeneity, where the phenotype, the genotype, both have various heterogeneity, and it may be that there may not be any family history. He or she may be the only proband in the family. So there is high chances that it could be a de novo change. Right? So in such cases in which there is a variable phenotype, you can send for exome sequencing or genome sequencing as affordability. There are some cases in which there may be two unrelated phenotypes in one patient, or there are two siblings, they have partial phenotype match. One may be more severe, one may be lesser, or they both may be having different phenotypes. So it is not necessarily like we have been taught that we have to try to fit everything into one diagnosis. We are coming into an era where there are overlapping phenotypes, there are dual phenotypes, there are blending phenotypes. So in such cases, it is better to send for the bigger panel or what is known as exome sequencing or genome sequencing, or for unknown diagnosis where you are not sure what you're looking at, but you just have the clinical presentation with you. The child suddenly died. We don't have the proband with us, but the parents are giving some vague description. In such cases where the differential diagnosis is wide, it is better to go for the higher level of testing. So ultimately, what to send depends on your clinical indications. So as I told, clinical exome is something which was customized, or we can call it as a targeted exome. Why it is targeted? Because we are not taking all the genes, but we are taking genes which have a very good, would say, a phenotype related to it. So all the genes which have a very good phenotype, which has been described, if we take them, pickup rate increases. So the diagnostic yield, which we say, improves at a lower cost. So 95% of the protein coding sequence of current clinically offered disease genes are assessed. The newer clinical exome, since it is customized, the lab or the company itself can add things into it, remove things from it, unlike what is provided from the service provider. So sometimes exons are there, but sometimes untranslated regions, which usually may not be picked up by the other panels. Then there are newer and upgraded pipelines. So they may have their own team of bioinformaticians who can upgrade the pipelines. So along with SNPs, you can also pick up indels, you can pick up CNVs, and so algorithms keep on changing. And even reported deep intronic variants can be included in the newer versions because of the upgradation. They can upgrade their kit very fast, unlike what comes from the company. So it is a preferential gene coverage. If some genes are not very well covered in the whole exome, but if we are customizing it and we see that there are certain researchers in our country or in our purview who are doing and they want to focus on these genes, it can be added with a better coverage, better probe sets. So what I was talking about OMIM is, if you check OMIM, the number of phenotypes for which a molecular basis is known is around 6,000, and total number of genes with phenotype causing mutation are around 4,000. So we have 20,000 genes, out of which we have an approximate like 6,000 to 7,000 genes for which we have adequate information with confidence, right? So when we have to interpret, we have to have some proof of why we are giving it. So the newer versions of clinical exomes, as I described, the coverage might be better. Additional genes can be added, which were not there in the previous clinical exome, but we don't want as many as which are there in the whole exome. So we can sort of add them. There are many genes which have been, like the previous version of clinical exome had 8,000 genes, but current version has 6,000 genes because there were almost 2,000 genes which are there in OMIM, but they don't have a phenotype. They are not well characterized. They are not well worked up. So we could remove those genes and add the old genes with a better coverage. So the genes, so as I told, with the same amount of data, we are increasing the coverage of the genes, decreasing the genes which are not important, right? So based on this, the newer versions of clinical exome are becoming better compared to the exomes. So why clinical exome? As I told, the most important was like around 5-6 years back when it all started, the difference was very high. 50,000-60,000 for a whole exome, it was not possible. So a better balancing act was, let us come with a collection of genes which we can do at a lesser test. But now the cost difference is decreasing. Whole exome is getting cheaper, whole genome is getting cheaper. So it's better if affordability is not an issue, we can go in for the whole exome. We can also see that whole exome is non-preferential and it is provided by the service company. We should always ask for the gene coverage or the comparative coverage of your genes of interest. OI genes, there were just 3 or 4 genes, but now we have 18 genes. And whole exome, if we see, the platform was 2015, 2016, probably 17 when the last platform was updated. And there are 3 or 4 genes which were not covered in the whole exome, but since the clinical exome has recently been upgraded, the newer genes are covered in that. So whenever you even send for a panel, you should always ask, please send us the coverage of these genes in your panel, in your clinical exome, and your whole exome. So wherever you feel that your gene of interest is best covered, you can offer that. So limitations of clinical exome or whole exome, since we are doing targeted, we are just focusing on the exomes. So the limitations would remain the same. So there are complex regions, SNP cluster regions or repeat regions in the genome, which will not be covered by clinical exome or whole exome. There are certain technical issues. I will take that in the next slide. There are certain pseudogenes like SMN1, SMN2. There is almost 99% homology. They are different at only 2 nucleotides. They're different. So for such pseudogenes, CH has almost like CYP21A2 has 32 pseudogenes. So when we see that there are so many pseudogenes, the reference sequencing which we are aligning to can go and align to a pseudogene also. Though there are algorithms which can help us differentiate between a pseudogene and a true gene, it is often good that we confirm it by Sanger. So as I told, deep intronic regions, since we are covering the exon, deep intronic or what we call as non-coding regions will not be covered. And mitochondrial genes having deletion duplications will not be covered in NGS, in clinical exome. So for mitochondrial genes, we have to have a mitochondrial genome. And detection of large deletion duplications or copy number variants, though there are algorithms, though they are being included in the pipeline, they are still at the validation age. So the pickup rate of heterozygous copy number variants could be anywhere between 65 to 70%, and homozygous is as high as 90%. But yet we still want to validate with a more robust and gold standard method. So these are some technical failures why NGS may give a false result, or there is no probe for the gene, there is not sufficient coverage of the region, and then the variant is present but not identified, filtering may accidentally remove the variant, then there is genetic heterogeneity. So there are many reasons why we might not get a good result from NGS. So whole genome, whole exome, again the difference lies in the amount of data you will be getting from whole genome. The cost is exorbitant for the whole genome. So exome becomes more cost effective if you want to decide between whole genome or whole exome. Challenges are that still whole exome will not interpret many Mendelian disorders, and rare variants may need larger sample size. So just by doing 1 or 2 clinical diagnosis samples, we may not be able to interpret. And exome might miss regions, that has already been shown. So why whole genome is better? It uses PCR-free protocols. So there is no amplification required. So the bias and gaps which are associated when we use PCR for preparing the data, right? So it gives a uniform coverage. So they are not breaks. So whole exome, if you see, there would be exome, then there would be nothing, then there would be a coverage of one exome, then nothing, then. But in whole exome, there is a uniform coverage, and so it is better. Now to get this, again, the same data, the average read depth is 30x compared to a whole exome, which would require 100x. So for whole exome, the limitation is that it has PCR biases, and we have to have an average depth of 100x, and this depth is required to minimize the number of insufficient data. Compared to a whole genome, it has a uniform coverage and it can be read at a lower depth also. So it is better in that way. But again, more is not always better, because we are going to get new genes, we are going to get new variants. But for them to confirm, for validating them, we need many functional studies or more tests or furthermore analysis, and few cases of 1 or 2 probands. It is not really cost effective to go in for so much of functional studies. Moreover, there are large number of genes, right, which we don't have much literature about. So even if they are coming out, we don't know what to do, and so the number of variant of uncertain significance will rise because we don't have adequate knowledge for these genes. So more is not always better. So I think next 2 or 3 slides, I had made a lot of slides, but we'll have to take it in 2 sessions now. So ultimately, it is not so easy and not so happy-go-lucky that we have got something and we are going to just sit on a computer and get out the result in one day. We have to dig and dig and dig to get a final diagnosis. This is a very common question asked by many people. So I'm sorry, I got a message. Let me just go through that first. Okay, sorry. Right. So whether Sanger confirmation is required. I especially took 2 or 3 slides to explain this because it is a very common question and everybody wants to know why we are not doing Sanger confirmation for the variant. So yes, Sanger confirmation is deemed necessary, but there are many studies who have shown that false positive are primarily due to the quality of the reported NGS variant. So once we know that the variant is not of a good quality, for those variants we can do a Sanger. But if there is 100% concordance, we have many studies showing this. These are just 2 or 3. 1200 NGS variants, 100% concordance. 5,800 variants, 99.9% concordance. And then this is again 3. Here also there is a concordance of 99. We had a similar done in MedGenome also, in which almost 7,000 NGS variants and the concordance was 99%. Reason was discordance was that there was a high genomic complexity in the region and a low read depth in 2 of these samples. So when the concordance is so high, to confirm the variant, it is not necessary to do the Sanger, but there are certain I'm sorry, just a minute. Okay, never mind. So I had 7 points here, but probably animation didn't work well. So where there are read depth less than 10x, or where there are variants in similar pseudogenes, where there is a strand bias, In those conditions, we might have to do a Sanger confirmation. If you see this IGV, it is showing 100% of the reads, but there are just 4 reads and all are in the reverse strand. So this looks like a homozygous 4 base pair, 4 reads, sorry, but when we confirmed it by Sanger, it was a heterozygous variant, right? So and then there are complex regions in the where there are repeats, CAG repeats, GG repeats, or CG rich regions, which might give you false positivity. And in those, so these, which are the technical difficulties, are often taken care of by the lab itself. There will be very few cases in which you may want to do a Sanger sequencing. So for homozygous variants, sometimes to confirm whether it is really homozygous or if the other allele has a deletion, you may have to do it. When you get a compound het or a homozygous variant, then parental testing is important, because if it is homozygous or compound homozygous, you have to confirm whether it is in, one is coming from the father and one is from the mother. So that confirms that it is in trans. In heterozygous also, you want to confirm whether it is a de novo variant by testing the parents. And then finally, for prenatal diagnosis or extended family screening, always better to go for a Sanger confirmation. But Sanger is also not free from errors. There could be allelic dropouts. Sometimes you may require multiple primer designing, and that is what is done in prenatal. We always use 2 sets of primers with different designing, so that we may not miss out on any due to a repeated sequencing or some probe error. So this is probably the conclusion of my first part. So molecular testing, if you just want to decide what to do, is if you are having a genetic condition which is very typical of certain features, and you do a biochemistry, you do X-rays, or you do some biochemical testing, and a single gene is involved, it is always better to go for the smaller test, smaller or the more confirmatory test. It could be MLPA, it could be triple repeat expansion studies, right? But if the same diagnosis has multiple genes involved, then it is better to go for a NGS gene panel testing. So, you know, what I prefer is always do a pre-test counseling to the parent, that we are suspecting this has multiple etiologies. We are trying to send the first steps testing. If it comes in the first step itself, it is well and good. Otherwise, we may have to go for further testing. So if the parents or the patient or the family is made aware that there could be multiple steps involved, they will be always ready to go further. Okay, so when NGS panel testing is negative, and you have multiple non-specific concerns, or there is some unknown etiology which you have, and you have that there is no typical gene panel available, then depending on the phenotype, you might have to go for microarray, or you may decide on the exome. Preferably it is a trioexome if the gene panel, here see again, since I have picked it up from international paper, we have no clinical exome, but you can go for clinical exome or NGS panel testing. If that is negative, you can go for trioexome or genome. But if even that is negative, then probably we may have to go for more discovery new genes, right? So probably I'll put an end to my talk of the first part.
Yeah, as you can see, we had received a couple of questions in the registration process itself, and I think Dr. Sheetal, you've already incorporated most of them in your presentation. And as usual, we see a lot of questions from the audience, from the live audience, and maybe we can take up some of these questions.
Yeah, so I had received few questions before, and there were 2 questions which I really wanted to cover up. I was planning not to cover them, but since it was a question, I thought let me go about it. So how to check for mitochondrial genetic disorder by NGS with help of, well, either we should isolate the mitochondrial genome or nuclear genome. So mitochondrial genetic disorders have nuclear genes also and mitochondrial genes also. So it is better that after your clinical confirmation, what type of mitochondrial disorder you're suspecting, you may have to do a combination of both. So if it is a condition like Leigh syndrome, which has nuclear as well as mitochondrial, you can send a combo, or you can go in for the nuclear genome first and then go for mitochondrial. The only limitation for mitochondrial genome is that we have to check for homoplasmy in the tissue of affection. So ideally, or as per literature, it is better if we do it in the muscle tissue, or the tissue which is involved. Unfortunately, we can't do it in the brain tissue or eye tissue, but any tissue which is more having more of mitochondria, or the muscle involvement is probably like mitochondrial myopathy, you can have. So you have to compare whether in the blood it is homoplasmy and in the muscle it is heteroplasmy. So it will give a better conclusion. Doing it in the blood is that we need the depth size or the read length, the coverage has to be much higher. So and there are also deletion duplications known. So we have MLPA also for certain mitochondrial genes in which it is known. So you have to inform whether it is MELAS, MOS, concise, or disorders which are having known pathogenic variants in mitochondrial genome. Then better to send mitochondrial genome first. Okay, so why triple repeats are not picked up by NGS? I will take that. I wanted to take this up separately, so I have made 2 slides for that. I will cover it later on. Interpretation and checking for data found and its functional and future aspects. Now, this is a very big, I have already discussed the interpretation. I have also discussed that how we finally conform to the pathogenicity or classification of the variants. And future aspects I will be taking up in the next session, where I will see the clinical utility of NGS. So confirmation of a novel mutation, as I have told, that if it is a heterozygous variant, you can do it in the parents just to prove that it is de novo. We search for literature that there is no data, but how to confirm is whether that novel variation is responsible for that patient. I think without functional studies or basic studies confirming how the variant is going to cause any change in the protein needs to be done. Indication of whole genome I have discussed. Clinical exome versus whole exome. So the clinician has asked if we specify a disease, are only those genes done, and in case will the patient benefit by doing whole exome. So here again it depends on your clinical suspicion. So ALS versus hereditary spastic paraparesis, this is a wide variation, right? So you need to see that as per literature currently, whether the genes which are implicated in ALS and HSP are covered in clinical exome, right? So if you say you are suspecting those, and if you're doing clinical exome, irrespective of what you have written, we do screen all the genes which are there in the clinical exome. We focus more on the genes of interest. We check them without filters just to see even high MAP variants or low depth variants are not filtered out. So if your clinical diagnosis and differentiating diagnosis is what we depend on, is only for the final filtering out of variants. Otherwise, all the genes are sequenced. So whether you send for clinical exome or whole exome, again, as I have told, depends on the genotype-phenotype match. Why the tests are so costly? Well, everybody knows that when something new comes up, it is costly. The only thing is, first, there were no tests. We used to send it outside, right? So now the tests are there. Then we try to find, okay, the tests are not available in India. Now the tests are available in India. So now we have a reason that why tests are so costly. But the costs are going down. So a test or a clinical exam, which I myself have sent 5 years back, costed me 45,000, but now I can do it for 20 to 21,000. So yes, the costs are high because it is a very high throughput test done by very few people. So as the number of tests increases, as the machine rates come down, as I've discussed, everything is going down. What is the chance for error in a test? So I would like to know what test. So any test or any lab error can go as, so NGS, as I discussed, 0.1 to 13%, depending on short reads or long reads. right? So this is the mitochondrial genome. So mitochondrial genome is different from nuclear genome. So when you send a clinical exome or a whole exome, we are doing the nuclear DNA. But when you send for mitochondrial, we do the mitochondrial genome. It is a selective amplification and the mitochondrial genome is sequenced. It has only 37 genes and they are tested. So this is a dummy report where you see that in, here it would be written MT. MT is mitochondrial. This is the gene name. Again, you can see the variant. And instead of heterozygous or homozygous, we have to write heteroplasmy. So heteroplasmy means it will be causing the disorders. And here you can see the chromosome is the mitochondrial genome. And the depth you can see is 11,000 times. So for somatic mutations or for mitochondrial mutations, the depth has to be very, very, very high. So now for trinucleate expansion repeats, why it is not covered? Because these repeats they are normally also present, right? So there are these bases or microsatellite, what are known as short tandem repeats or microsatellite repeats are, exome is just 1%. So what is 99%? It is just these repeats sometimes, and they are considered to be unsequenceable. So it may not be impossible, but it is difficult when we use small base pair. So if you have a CAG repeat, right? So now this is a 5 times CAG repeat, so it is 15 base pair. And our sequence itself is of a 150 base pair. So sometimes the expansion will go beyond the size of our sequence. So more than 40 neurological disorders are there, and you can see that the expansion range for a patient to be affected would be more than 30 times of that repeat. So if a CAG repeat has to be repeated more than 30 times, means the expansion would be 900 base pair. So that cannot be covered in a 150 base pair sequencing, what is known as a short base pairs. So there are newer companies coming up, newer technologies, which have like repeat size of 10,000 base pairs. So this does gives the advantage that we may be able to do the triple repeats maybe in a few years, but these have a very high error rate, almost more than like, we have papers in which they say that error rate may be more than 15-16%, right? So until and unless we have accurate, robust and reproducible computational tools, even this long read sequencing will be like a little difficult, but hopefully we will be able to do it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheetal, for taking time off from your schedule and giving us this very in-depth presentation. And we understand that it's a very vast topic and just one session would not do justice to this. So we will plan for the second session as soon as possible and get back to you on this. So audience, once again, thank you for taking time off from your busy schedules and attending this webinar. Since you've already registered for this webinar, we will send you the link to the second session in a day or two. Please look out for that in your inbox. You don't have to register again. And any questions, as I mentioned, please send them over to diagnostics@medgenome.com. So thank you again for your time and your efforts, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, all of you. See you next time.